Hey everyone. Ableton Live 11 has recently been announced, and it is one of the biggest updates to the software yet. I'm going to be talking about some of my favorite new features and some ideas on how to use them creatively for songwriting. I want to start by sharing that within the last 2 years, I dove into the world of modular synthesis, and it has been so inspiring. Some of my favorite concepts in modular synthesis are melodic quantization and controlled randomness. Live 11 implements these concepts really nicely in the new update, and we're going to be exploring that today. Let's start by looking at some basic ways to get things set up. Then, we will be exploring how we can take things further creatively. Alright, so we're going to start off with an empty project here. I have a single MIDI channel. I'm going to create a new MIDI clip by double-clicking on this empty slot right here, and that gives us our familiar piano roll. So the first feature we're going to look at is the scale. This is kind of similar to melodic quantization within modular synthesis. I'm going to activate that by clicking on the button that says scale on the lower left-hand corner. Once I do that, you're going to see my piano roll now has highlights based on the color of that specific channel. I also get an indicator for where that specific scale starts. So right now it's on C, which is the default. I could change that up by clicking on the first drop-down menu here. Let's try a G. And that changes my piano roll to now indicate the G within each octave. And we could also change the type of scale by looking at the second drop-down menu. If you're familiar with an Ableton push, these are the same set of scales. One of my favorite scales to work with is the Phrygian dominant. It sounds very interesting, so I'm going to click on that for now. You can see that the highlights now change. Now technically we still have a chromatic scale here within our piano roll because I'm still able to click on the notes that are outside of the scale. So if I really wanted to narrow my options down, I could actually click on the second scale button right within the piano roll, and that eliminates all the notes that are outside of the scale. So now all I have within my piano roll are the highlighted notes. I can actually come up with something very simple here. I'm going to start with the tonic G, and I'm actually just gonna jot down some random notes here, not even thinking too much about the rhythm or the melody, just to show you what we could come up with easily. Alright, some very random notes, and to hear that we're gonna have to add an instrument. So I'm gonna go over here to my instruments. I really like Wavetable. I'm going to choose the basic vintage pluck preset within Wavetable. Something very simple. Like this right here. And I'm not even going to mess around too much with the controls. I'm going to leave it as is. So we just want to hear what we came up with. So I'm going to hit play right here, and here's what we have. Alright, pretty interesting. And it's looping, so it's easy to get a groove from that specific set of notes. Now this is the most straightforward way to use that feature. It's very useful for people who want to work just within the computer, or maybe you're on the go and you don't have a controller with you. It makes things very, very easy. But what I want to do here is take things a little bit further creatively. Let's look at how we could maybe come up with some things that might be a little bit more dynamic and a little bit more complicated. So I'm going to delete what we have for now. Now, the idea I'm going to get into is kind of an idea that I got from modular synthesis. With modular synthesis, you could come up with a lot of really interesting things by connecting things that might not have been meant to be connected. What I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to try connecting a rhythmic device meant for drums, and I'm going to send the MIDI notes from that rhythmic device to this instrument that is basically a melodic instrument. So we get something a little bit more rhythmic, obviously, because it's meant for the drums, but it's also going to be a little bit more interesting than what we came up with, because with something like the drums, you get multiple notes that are playing at the same time, and the notes that we get might not necessarily be chords that are within the scale. We could actually change that up by looking at the quantized piano roll that we had before. So before I get too far ahead, let's just set that up. First thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to get into my Max for Live devices that I've already narrowed down. And I'm actually going to use a Max for Live device called Instant House. For those of you who have used Instant House before, you're going to know that Instant House is basically a Max for Live device that has a couple of different algorithms that make it very easy to come up with beats within house or breaks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag Instant House to a separate MIDI channel. The reason I'm dragging it to a separate MIDI channel is because I will want to record the MIDI notes within a MIDI clip. I can't drag it to that same channel because although I'll hear the notes playing within that specific channel, a MIDI clip can only record incoming notes coming from either another MIDI channel or a controller. So that's the reason I have it set up this way. Now to complete that setup, I'm going to get into my routing by heading over to the lower right hand corner here. I'm going to click on the button with an I and an O. It's input and output. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to tell that rhythmic channel, my MIDI channel over here to the right, I'm going to tell it to send the MIDI notes to channel 1, which is my melodic instrument. So I'm going to say MIDI 2. I'm going to say basic vintage pluck. And we're generally set up right now. So a couple of basic things to know within Instant House for those of you who haven't used it before. You basically have 4 different components here, one for each area of the drum set. You got a kick, a snare, a hi-hat, and percussion device. You have specific notes here that you're meant to route to whichever cell within the drum rack you have for your kick, snare, hi-hat, and perc specifically. And you could always change that up if you wanted to trigger another cell within that drum rack or whatever device you have. So for now, what we're going to be doing is we're actually going to just leave it as is because we will have the ability to edit it later on and quantize it within the scale that we already have within our first channel. But what I will be doing, more importantly, is I'm going to be choosing the patterns here. So if I leave it at 1, you get a very basic 4 on the floor pattern. And as you move it clockwise to the right, you get more complicated rhythms from those specific components. So let's try coming up with something random here, and we could always re-record and come up with another combination. So let's see what we have. I'm gonna have my kick maybe at, I don't know, 4. Have this at 6, 14, and let's try 3. Alright, so now that we have that set up, we actually don't need a MIDI clip here because this is going to be outputting the notes directly to my first channel because we've already routed it. What I will be doing is I'm going to arm my first channel, and that turns these empty slots into recording slots. You now have circles instead of squares, and I could click any of these circles to start recording within that specific slot. So that's all I'm going to be doing. I'm going to be paying attention to maybe record a sequence of maybe 4 bars. Could always go beyond that and just crop it out later on if we need to. So I'm going to click on this right here. Alright, we're going to stop right there. We've got a 4-bar sequence. And you're going to see one of the interesting features of the scale that we were looking at a while ago. So since we didn't necessarily set the notes to be notes within our scale, we were basically outputting notes that may have been outside of that scale that we chose. Great thing here is, in spite of it being outside the scale, I still see the notes on screen and I could easily correct them. So I could actually click over here, move it up to a note within the scale that is highlighted in green. Click on this one right here because it's out of scale as well, and you move that up or down, really either or. Now if you wanted to remove these distractions here, I could click on scale, deactivate it, click on it again, and all you have on screen are the notes within the scale. So let's hear what we have. So we could also change it up as we go if you wanted to maybe get a feel of other notes that might work better. Now you could also remember here that your movement doesn't necessarily have to be just up or down. I could also move it to the left or to the right, because the great thing about these rhythms is once you offset them left or right, you get a slightly more interesting polyrhythm. So let's try that out. Alright, you can see it's getting a little bit more interesting as we move the notes up and down. Now, another thing we could do here is to make it a little bit more dynamic. Instead of having a very repetitive 4-bar loop here, I could also change the notes within each segment of my MIDI clip. So for example, I could maybe choose a couple of notes here on the second bar, and I could actually move that slightly higher. Maybe choose the same set of notes here, move that higher, and the last set of notes here. So again, this is really random. I didn't necessarily audition it, but we could always edit it as we play it back. So let's hear what we came up with. Alright, sounds a little bit more interesting and kind of gives you an idea of what you could do here. The possibilities are basically limitless. I could keep working on this until I get something I really like, but it's very easy to come up with a very simple idea that I could just mess around with. Even if I didn't have an idea to begin with, it's something that could really motivate you and inspire you to come up with the rest of the song. So I want to do something else here. We were using Instant House a while ago, and I just want to give you guys another example here. Another really amazing rhythmic device that we could use is the rotating rhythm generator. So this works a little bit differently. The great thing about this device is you have access to what we call Euclidean patterns. And Euclidean patterns are very common in genres like techno or anything that involves polyrhythms, even IDM. This comes up with a slightly different approach than Instant House, because Instant House is basically a couple of different algorithms that are meant to work well with house beats or break beats, whereas rotating rhythm generator will just basically output rhythms not necessarily meant for beats, but rhythms that are very easy to get a groove from. So we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to click on my MIDI channel here. I can actually just replace Instant House. I'm going to delete that. And I'm going to drag the rotating rhythm generator right to that same channel. So I don't need to route it anymore because it's already set up. And what I'm going to do here, there are a lot of different ways to get this set up, but what I specifically want to use this for is the Euclidean rhythms or Euclidean patterns that it could generate. So I'm going to click on Euclid here, Euclid here, Euclid here, and over here. So kind of a similar setup here. You have your 4 components. You have a different note for each area, and really the main thing we're going to be looking at here are the steps and the fills. Right. So generally these define the length or the available slots that you could put notes in, and then the second area will define the amount of notes that you're actually putting in those slots. So I'm gonna change this up a little bit, and I want to show you a different approach that you could technically also apply to Instant House. Initially, we basically left all the notes as is, and we corrected it later on. Now, the other thing you can do is you could set it up to have the right notes from the get-go. I'm going to go over here to my MIDI clip. I'm actually going to look at the notes we have within the scale. So I know that my tonic is G, so I definitely kind of usually want to have G in that rhythm. And I'm going to choose another set of notes here. I'm going to choose 3 different notes. So we could do G, B, D, and F. So G, B, D, and F. We're going to set that up right here. G, B, D, and F. All right. So we're not going to pay too much attention to the octaves for now. That is something we could still edit later on. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to narrow down the steps here, because 64 is a lot. It's actually your maximum. We're going to change it up. I'm going to use 16 for the first, which is a multiple of 4, making it simple. For fills, this is where it could kind of get interesting. So you could choose a very off number here, kind of like an odd number to give you an odd rhythm that will still be very groovy. we're gonna change the second one to, let's try 8. Change this to something like 3. And for these other ones, I'm going to choose some really weird numbers. So let's try 5. Let's try 6. Alright, so it's the same thing. I'm going to hit record on an empty slot here to record the incoming MIDI notes. Alright, so that's what we have. So you can kind of tell that the rhythm we get from this device is very different from the rhythm we got from the other device. It doesn't sound like it was meant for the drums, but it's also a very interesting pattern nonetheless. And we could go with the same approach here. We could maybe choose a couple of notes from the second part. This time I'm actually going to highlight all the notes, see how that works out. Same thing here. And right over here. Let's hear how that sounds. Alright, I think it sounds pretty cool. I am actually liking this rhythm a little bit more than the first one. But it just kind of shows you the different variations and different ideas you could come up with just by combining a couple of different modules or different devices together. Alright, so now we have two very interesting patterns. I want to look at some of the other features that kind of play into the concept of controlled randomness within Ableton Live 11. So we're going to focus on a couple of different things here. Some of the controls or the buttons here that we haven't yet activated. I'm going to click on these right here on the lower left hand corner of my piano roll. The first button here will activate your velocity. Your second button here will activate your chance or probability. So great thing about this area right here is this basically varies the chance of the note playing. So it basically gives you a continuously evolving rhythm every time the loop plays out. So maybe for one loop I'll hear a set of notes, but for the next run of that loop I might hear another set of notes. So let's try changing that up. I could manually drag these up and down to set specific chance values. So you can be really detailed about it. Another thing you can do, might be a little bit easier if you don't have a very specific idea in mind, is I could click on randomize here. And if I highlight everything, I'm going to hit Command A and randomize. It actually randomizes all the values. So it's pretty interesting. You basically get everything from 100 to even something as low as like nearly less than 10%. So instead of hearing that same rhythm over and over again, now every play I get will have a different set of notes. So let's hear what it comes out. Oop, wrong clip. Alright, so let's hear what it sounds like. Alright, sounds pretty cool. Let's try that out with our second clip here. I'm going to do the same thing. Easy thing to do is just Command A, highlight everything, and randomize. Now another thing you can do here, just to show you another approach, is I could actually narrow down the percentage. So instead of having 100%, I could say, let's just play within 60%. Alright, hit randomize. And you now see that the range is just within 60%. You're not getting anything lower than that value I was mentioning a while ago, like 10% or less. So let's play it out. Alright, sounds pretty interesting. Now another thing you could do here, again, to take it a little bit further, is you can also set a range for the velocity, so you always get a different velocity, and it's another way to make it sound a little bit more organic and in some ways even a little bit more human. The way I could do that is I could actually go into any of these right here. I can even highlight everything like I did a while ago. And when I hold Command down and I click and drag, you see sort of like a shade here moving downward. What that means is basically every time I play that note, it will play any velocity value from this point all the way till this point. So it's always going to be different. Works great with very velocity sensitive instruments. So let's see what we come up with here. Let me make the range a little bit more so we get a little bit more variation. Let's play it out. Alright, so a slight bit more variation. We could always change up the instrument so we get something a little bit more velocity sensitive, but I think I'm still liking the sound. Let's do the same thing here. So another thing we can do, just to show you a couple of different approaches, is I could also just change this up right here. And when I drag this area up or down, you're getting the same thing. You're basically getting a range of notes. So I can move it up or I can move it down. Totally up to you. Let's hear what that sounds like. Alright, sounding pretty cool. I'm actually liking both of them a lot. So you get a very interesting melody just by taking advantage of some of the new features and combining them with some older Max for Live devices here that I really like. And basically all that's missing is like maybe a bass line and a beat, but we have a very good starting point for a song. Now the last thing I'm going to do here, again, just to add a little bit more to that concept of controlled randomness, is I'm going to look at another Max for Live device here to add a bit more movement. So I'm going to drag in the LFO MIDI device. And what this does is it allows you to route a low frequency oscillator to any control that you can map with MIDI. So I'm going to drag this in to that same MIDI channel. And by default, I get a sine that is running at a specific frequency. First thing I'm going to do here is I definitely want the frequency to match with my BPM. So I'm going to click on the frequency button right here, and that actually shifts it to sync. And once it's set to sync, you're going to notice a couple of different things. Your rate is now set to a division of time. Choose something like 1/8. And the second thing you're going to notice is you actually don't get the oscillation. Because it's synced to my master BPM, you will only get the oscillator running once I hit play. So that's a little bit different. Now, another thing I want to do here is instead of just using a very straight up sine wave, which you can if you wanted to really play to that randomness aspect of what we were talking about, I could actually click on this drop down menu and choose a couple of different waveforms here. I could actually choose random if I wanted to. All right. So once we choose that, there are a couple of really important controls that we could use to narrow down the range and just set a good value for whichever we choose to control here. I think what I'm going to map this to, I'm going to click on this map button right here, is the decay, because the decay tends to be very audible. I could get notes that are short and notes that are a little bit longer. So to give you an idea of what that might sound like, I'm going to do it manually. So I'll play it out. Alright, so by playing around with the mouse, I'm also able to kind of gauge what range I want. I don't have to go from 0 all the way to 100. I could actually narrow that down. So what I'm going to do, the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to use this offset knob to set the very beginning of the range. And the depth here will basically set the end part of the range, or how far it goes. So let's play around with it. I'm going to hit play here. Actually, let me map that first. So I'm going to click on map and I'm going to click on decay. And once it's mapped to that, you're going to notice that once I hit play, it's going to start moving up and down, and I could control that range with the offset and depth while auditioning it at the same time. So let's check it out. Alright, so you can see that with the initial default values, it's just way too wide. You get notes that are way too short. On the upper end, it's sounding okay, but I definitely don't want notes that short. So I'm gonna move my offset here, maybe a little bit higher. So it's starting a little bit higher. I think it's sounding pretty good. Let's hear it with our other MIDI clip here. Cool. We're still getting that same dynamic. And that's basically it. We have a very interesting set of MIDI clips here, which I could pretty much use for a song. If I wanted to create a bass line to complement that, I could pretty much do the same thing for the bass line, where I narrow it down to the same set of notes I have within the scale I'm using for this kind of like chord progression / lead melody I have. I hope that gives you some ideas and inspires you to work on some music. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. Hope you guys enjoyed that. Catch you guys next time.